All right. Still waiting for folks to join in. You guys, can you hear my voice okay? For a couple more folks to jump in here. Just give it a couple more minutes. There's a PDF also to the lecture that I put on Canvas. I'm sure if you found this link, you'll see them up there. All right, I see. Well, and then begin. If you have buddies in the class and you have their phone numbers or something, helps to kind of sending them a reminder. If not, we'll just start with whoever that can join. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and start, and then people can jump in, and we'll put the rest of this online. You know, in the comments, I'll keep an eye on them, ask questions and whatnot. If for some reason you want to do it another way, you can always send me an email, and my phone numbers, of course, they're on the canvas. I get to folks pretty quickly. Yeah, and we're just going to go ahead and do the best we can. Today is basically the official start of the classes. So I've gone ahead and pushed back all of the deadlines for the work submitted. Um, so just pay attention to those, start applying them, submitting them in. The directions are all there. If you have any questions, ask me. Yeah, okay, so we are going ahead on your PDFs. I try to include the numbers. Hopefully they catch up on there too. I'm on number we Reza Shah. So we are on the nationalist movement in early 1950s. Yeah, actually, this is kind of, yeah. Um, just give you a couple minutes to get there. Not a couple minutes, a couple of seconds, I guess. Um, okay, so let's jump into the last time we talked about just to do a little vying for power, especially against the power of the monarch, which is Mohammad Reza Shah. And you're seeing you saw the development of a couple of parties on the ground and parliamentary coalitions. But after the assassination attempt on Reza Shah, things start to change. There are reforms that are connected to the parliaments, which is momentarily kind of abolished for a bit. There is the Abadan uprising in the oil refinery, which we saw the British try to appeal, both pressure Iran with their military and then appeal to the higher authorities of these world courts that are themselves very new. Right? They're developing after the events of the World War II. And yeah, but then there is this kind of parliamentary standstill where the government cannot go through. Right? There's too much faction. There's not this kind of established culture of working together to pass laws, and then there is also this uncertain, arbitrary power of the Shah that is interfering. So there is a kind of a political turmoil right now. Which so this all so both Shah and, if we are to kind of use Mossadegh's names as this movement of the Nationalist Party, there are both making alliances and enemies with every step they take, and everything is happening very quickly. So this basically what we talked about last time is laying the ground. Mossadegh is having a coalition with the Tudeh and some other parties, but then he, like I said, he does have some people that oppose him, and at this time there is an attempt on his life in July of 1953, which kind of as the head of, as a prime minister now, not a parliamentary, which leads him to again dissolve the Majlis, because he wants to kind of flush this out and develop a new parliamentary body. So he's not kind of he wants to put on new elections, right? Bring new blood in, especially people who, of course, he has strong coalitions against. Because as we say, we got to remember, because Mossadegh's main goal is to use the parliament in order to curtail the power of the monarch, who is the Mohammad Reza Shah. And we saw that there was appeals towards coup and regime change in Iran under Truman, which from the British side, but Truman wasn't really interested in this. But Dwight Eisenhower, who was himself a military man, um, kind of is coming into this new world, and he thinks that there needs to be actions towards. It's kind of interesting because most in America, Dwight Eisenhower is kind of remembered for his military industrial complex speech, which he makes in as he's leaving the presidency in '61. But he was also himself the word that political word that we might use right now, a kind of a hawk, right? That he was for the use of force around the world. Um, for sometimes to pursue American interests, it's say that's how they would articulate it. But nevertheless, he is kind of interested in this idea of having a semi coup in Iran. But the problem is that at this time, this idea of having a regime change in another semi developed to a point nation that hasn't been tried. So this is actually like the first U.S. attempt at regime change in the 20th century. So the CIA, which is all itself a new kind of a part of a government, is, I believe it is called SIS. Before that, the name escapes me. Is kind of tasked with this regime change, and the agent that I don't think I put this in here. The agent that they use is Kermit Roosevelt. Kermit Roosevelt, who's actually related to the President Roosevelt before him. He the way this coup is basically working is the idea is to it costs the United States about $1 million. There is a very good book on this. It's called let me write it here. All the Shaw's Men. And then there is one, another one, more academic one, the Coup of '53, but by Ebrahimian. I think I have it in the class bibliography. That kind of goes through kind of sequential events of this coup. So basically the idea is that to build coalition inside Iran, and this kind of cost America at the time like $1 million, the whole thing. But it's mostly about bribing and building coalitions to oppose, not dethrone, to push Mossadegh out of Iran, especially out of his parliamentary seat. The problem is that he's really famous at this time, right? So this coup is not what later on develops within American policy with assassinations or proxy armies. It's not like that. It's very much centered in Tehran, and from factions inside the military to other parties and group and whatnot, it goes on. And the other aspects of it is information. Like, what kind of information are you passing out to the general public to kind of rile them up for different protests and whatnot? So in the mid-August, the Imperial Guard, which are the kind of the closest part of the army to the Shah, arrest all the Mossadegh loyalists, especially in the parliament. But Mossadegh basically kind of thwarts this coup because of the other more stronger coalitions that he has, especially in the army. And then there's riots and kind of demonstrations. There's this feeling of confusion inside the country right now, that what is happening, and the news of the events are kind of moving slowly. But there's this underestimation of how popular Mossadegh is, even with the people who are supposedly against him inside the government. the Shah at this time, he escapes. He sees this uprising. It's not the first or the last time that he's going to do this. Every time there's a turmoil inside the country, he does take off. He goes to Europe. A seat. He just like basically leaves and tells the people close to him that are staying back to run the country in a sense. So at the same time, there is this coup come up. There is this anti-monarchical right inside Iran. Then there is kind of especially with to hear about how the people. Well, yeah, I mean, this is an interesting idea, and this is kind of the escape of the Shah. Like Apache is doing it to calm the country down because he always sees, you understand that his presence there is part of the problem, but when he leaves the country, and this happens again, we'll talk about it in the 60s and 70s, people feel that it legitimizes his power, right? Because while he's seeing it as I'm gonna go, things gonna calm down, I'm gonna come back, people see it as fleeing. He starts being very confrontational with the West, right? Especially as he gains more power over the oil, as we see here with the nationalization. But this idea of leading to Europe or escaping there kind of becomes interpreted as that he is their underdog, right? Which is kind of this narrative that he can't never kind of get away from, even at times that, in reality is very much opposing this and that requests from outside the country. Yeah, so there is this at the same time that there are all these riots, there's a pro-Mossadegh a kind of uprising in the street to defend him and whatnot, and the Tudeh is joining him, and some of the religious establishment is joining him, but not too much, not a significant part of this uprising. But Mossadegh himself, who is we got to remember, he studied law, and he's a man of kind of modernity and lawfulness, government, and kind of doing things the right way, if you will, puts down this kind of supporting kind of populist movement, real-time populist movement, which then kind of signals again to the other faction who are kind of there, part of the coup to oppose him, to come take him out of the power. And this happens by arresting many of and people who are in kind of in coalition with him, and putting him in house arrest, which is a place near Tehran in Ahmedabad, in his home, which he is going to be there until the late 60s when he dies. But nevertheless, one thing is important, that Shah does come back after things kind of cool off a bit. But the most important thing to note is that the British monopoly over Iran oil end here. So Mossad is successful in that aspect, and the British still do owe some of it, as I said here, about 40%. But well, let's come back to this in the 60s. At this time, there is a British hold and U.S. hold, and then you have the Dutch and the French hold in the share of the company. Remember that we talked about that the British buy of this oil, but Iran starts getting more of the interest of the sale of the oil. But later on, Iran's oil does kind of come under Iran ownership. And this is because the movement that he had started in the parliament. There is a quick nullification of the land reforms that the Shah himself was part of starting at this time, and it sees Iran as the kind of the main actor within this new Middle East, right? Because you're also talking about the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, right? Iraq has gone through is now gaining independence, right? There's kind of a new leftist government in Iraq at the time, so and another thing, Israel also kind of become this. They start developing these technologies of internal security, right? Which is one as the Israelis are developing Mossad and how to kind of protect the country from threats without the use of actually hot war. Iran developed Savak, right? And these groups are with the CIA, Savak and Mossad are kind of training each other and help sharing information, while at the same time keep in mind that relations could change, right? And again, this becomes this idea of because of what we'll learn about Savak, that relationship between Iran, Israel, and the United States and Savak is basically never forgotten in the Iranian imagination. This is the next slide is a picture of Mossadegh. This is in Ahmedabad when he's under house arrest. Yeah, so after this coup, again, you have now Mossadegh being out of the picture, and the Shah is developing this kind of new way of arbitrary rule, which is that he kind of coalesces a lot of power after the coup, and one of the things that he does, as always, is it's the question of modernization, but this time modernization through policies that are making actual material change. And a way to do this is to I put some of the key points on here. So one is, again, land reform, as always. A lot of countries that want to modernize, they have to come out of this agrarian form of society and move into industrial nations of some sort. Um, and I'll talk about that second point, landlord and religious establishments, in further slides. I have to kind of talk about it a bit more. Nationalizations of woods and forests, right? This is, again, kind of like Roosevelt did in the United States, the development of national parks. And that also means you have to kind of consider this in the sense of, that a new idea is a private portion of the land, which then are kind of put into the common use. They're not in the commons, as we would understand from the English laws and some old common law ideas, but it's a new form because there's a bureaucracy in charge of these lands and how they manage them and whatnot. There's a question of women's suffrage. I have a slide for that later on. There's the literary course, which is this idea of, and we've seen with Mao's China, this kind of turning a society literate, right? And how do you do that? Well, by training people in the city and making them go teach other folks after college, like kind of like we have Kennedy set up those programs here in the United States for Teach America and stuff like that. Also, industrial profit sharing and also land profit sharing. This idea that there is this idea of taxes, right? But from early on, there is this between the landlords and the serfs, this idea that people are just working someone's land and then getting enough food to to eat for the year and then working that land forever, and so their kids, but also the profits that comes from sales of whatever is grown on the land are made in the industry with the workers, um, which would then help develop a society that one has money to buy the goods, just as we saw what Ford did in the United States, right? You don't want people to just work in car power plants. You want them to be able to buy your cars, right? And the government also wants them to be able to buy property, because people buy property, pay taxes. So you have to kind of think further with this. So I put them in kind of one sentence with them, but there are considered goals for these reforms. And also denationalization of some industries, right? Because you want foreign investments with money, and foreign investments also means international coalitions, one, which means safety, but also into kind of coming into international economy, right? Which means investments, which means development, which means happy population, which means so on and so forth. So now let's kind of fast forward. We have to kind of be like in the 50s into the 60s to understand what kind of world this, what the Shah called the Inqilab Safi, the White Revolution, was taking place in. It's a very kind of decade-long project, and at each epoch, it kind of focuses on a different specificity. So one is that we saw, right, it was a strict monarchical rule, because Shah is like, okay, I can't deal with the parliament. First of all, they're challenging me. Second of all, it's so much easier to have the monarch going ahead and pushing for changes. These projects are mainly funded through the mono economy, and the mono product economy here is, of course, oil, which Iran is. The price of oil right now is gradually going up. It becomes actually it goes way up in the 70s. We'll talk about that later, but um, right now it's the gradual rise in Iran, and just making bank off of this and really investing that back in the country, right? Especially the army, which I'll get to. Um, and with this kind of development of these small policies that are going in, there is this disproportionate change in society, right? There's mass movement into the cities because there are all these bureaucracies and private entities opening that need workers, and these workers, and on the other hand, this idea of agrarian life or pastoral life is really losing. It's not a viable way to live in Iran anymore. Of course, there are a ton of villages. I mean, there are still villages in Iran to this time. These people still exist in Iran, but at this time, there is enough of interest in this new life in this city that it takes a lot from these outside provinces into the cities to partake into this new modern world. So there are these new kind of subclasses, right? With the kind of petty bourgeois population, there is bureaucrats, urban professional, working class, merchants, right? And on the other hand, you still have the landlords, peasants, and the religious establishment. Now, these people are not exclusive to each other, but they kind of do see each other as at this, right? It's not rare for the city people to see the religious establishment in Qom and whatnot, or the landlords and the relationship to peasants as something that we need to overcome. This is kind of a universal feeling at this point, right? Like what the Stalin is trying to do with the agrarian movement, or Mao, or in Vietnam, or even the United States. You're trying to kind of move from this kind of lifestyle and not all of it is bad, of course. But and I'll focus on the landlord peasant relationship later on. But let's kind of keep myself from drifting off here. Hit these main points here. Um, at this time, Iran emerges in the world markets as kind of a global actor because it has a lot of oil money and it wants to import a lot of goods to kind of feed satisfy this new middle class that now has disposable income. But also, Iran needs a lot of machinery, technologies, and expertise to bring from the other world. Um, and at the same time, there is this kind of diminishing political and military powers of U.S. and Iran, U.S. and Britain and Iran. Britain really by the end of the 50s, it's not a viable power as much in Iran. And in the United States, it's not that the United States loses power. Actually, the United States kind of is developing into an empire right now. But Iran is just moving at this breakneck speed, right? And it's becoming somewhat independent, especially by the 60s and definitely by the 70s, right? Because one of the things that Shah does is developing. I mean, there is a modern army at this time, but just exponentially growing its how much the country is willing to expand on this. I think uh, I forgot these numbers. There's some interesting like 400% increase in military spending, and Iran is really going to U.S. all the time and kind of asking for military equipment, right? The state of the art stuff, right? And you hear about the military people in Iran at the time, you're like, we didn't even need some of this stuff because really didn't have a kind of neighborly threat at this time. And but the Shah was really interested to buy all this stuff. They end up kind of keeping Iran safe, maybe you can say that, but definitely in the Iran-Iraq war, this expenditure becomes very important. Um, but it also does kind of show Iran, at least as a military power at this time. There's a coalition with Israel at this time. They are both countries that are see themselves in antagonism to both in idea of identity and in a political sense against the Arab countries, um, especially as we're going into the idea of, I mean, Israel at this time, actually reading a book on this, is very much in kind of very sensitive situations that constantly turn into wars or series of assassinations with Egypt, Lebanon, and after the Ba'athist Party comes to power in Iraq, Iraq is also takes this very antagonistic kind of approach towards the state of Israel and Iran. And of course, if you remember, Iran did partially play a hand in the coup in Iraq before the Ba'athist Party come to power, and the Ba'athist Party comes to power over its leftist counterpart in the previous regime, with the help of the U.S. and the British also. Um, so it's this really complex idea, kind of Game of Thrones, if you will, of these constantly changing alliances and antagonisms that it's sometimes hard to keep up. Yeah. So Ba'athist Party, yes, and there's a failed coup in the Iraqi government in the 70s. Egypt is an exception to this Arab antagonism and Iran. Again, these are doesn't mean like real like hot antagonisms, right? It's just Iran sees them as competitors often. Um, but yeah, Egypt has a great relationship with Iran, and actually Shah goes there. And as if you remember, Shah then married an Egyptian princess, his first wife. Um, but then there's like a Bahrain question, right? Bahrain is another one of those kind of post-Ottoman British mandate lands that wants to become an independent country at this time, but for a while, Iran wants it as part of its territory, right? But not to in 1975, Bahrain kind of succeeds to gain its own independence, but Iran settles for a couple of islands in the Gulf at this time. But there is Iran. I mean, there is a big kind of Kurdish population in Iran. Iran does support this Kurdish insurgency, especially in places in Iraq and in Syria, and sometimes on the borders of Turkey, where Iran tries to kind of stay out of Turkey's way for the most part, but especially a way to kind of uh, check the power of the Ba'athist Party, especially Saddam's power in the region, is to keep the Kurds strong, but not strong enough that they can declare an independent state, because that would mean that Iran would also have to give away some of its land. And on the so now kind of going to a domestic ideological sense, there's this pan-Persian ideology. For example, Shah uh, uh, calls himself Arya Mehr, right? Arya is like the Mehr is light. He's like the light of the Aryans, and he does, for example, sets up the 2500th anniversary of the Persian Empire, right? Which is again connecting the Pahlavi regime not to this very specific part of its history, which would be the Achaemenids Empire, right? There are, by this time, a lot of people didn't within the Iranian national identity areas, Kurosh, like these kind of Turkish dynasties had a lot more connection to Persian identity than this what happened supposedly 2,500 years ago. But the Pahlavis, especially Mohammad Reza Shah, are very adamant on making that as the kind of pinnacle of Iranian identity and connected could connect, kind of associate themselves to that, right? And as you remember, Pahlavi is the name of a language that they pick. The paper that you have to write for a movie review, I just put a really kind of interesting and short documentary on the Shah's life overview, but they cover this 25th anniversary event that is talked about a lot in there. So make sure you check it out. And just, I mean, the idea of it is very interesting. It is often mischaracterized, especially that event, because often people make him like, oh, like the Iranian people were too that's not true. Like if you go and actually read the writings happen at the time, most of the criticisms come from the intellectual left at this time, right? That there is this all this foreigners here and kind of making a play of our country's history, right? So that is kind of the approach of kind of the intellectual criticism of the Shah at this point. I mean, there are, for example, movements at this point within the intellectual poet scene that are again stitious and mystical, lyrical poetry of ancient Iran. Like we have to move forward. We have to be modern, right? We have to be critical. We have to have these find a new way of identifying ourselves. You get the idea, right? So there is a part of the intellectual movement that is just not into what they see the Orientalists are infatuated with. They actually, and the problem is that the Pahlavis regime really likes those images, right? Even there is this reconstruction, as we saw with Reza Shah, Mohammad Reza Shah's dad, reconstruction of open and making public places, right? So you kind of see there's always that kind of tension between the Iranian intellectuals and what the ruling dynasty chooses to fetishize and make important to them. So let's go to page 32 here. And he like Mossadegh did at one time, he does dissolve the parliament a couple of times, but he does it in a different way. It's not kind of very immediate. He wants to remove all these old parliamentarians, right? Kind of think of people like Mossadegh, right? Regardless if they had his ideas now, people who are kind of to the Shah's view are kind of young, and he wants this new people that are developing under this country that he set up to start partake in the country, right? So it's not so it's tyrannical, but it's not so kind of cut and dry here. And for the love of God, I don't know how to stop this screen. Really throws me off. Yeah, so he also wants to rejuvenate these bureaucracies and segments of the government by bringing new and younger people in that have seen the benefits of modernization, if you will, in his country. And there is no doubt that there are changes, right? So to get rid of some of these old guards, bring new people in. But he does dissolve all parties, and everyone, especially within the government, has to join the National Resurgence Party. So there's this one party within Iran, and everybody has to choose, be a part of that, which doesn't do anything to help him. I mean, because there is a level of electoral representative parliamentary system. I mean, for everyone to be in the party, I mean, people still go home and talk about other things, right? There is the Savak kind of presence here that does go after these factions that do actually in private and public are deemed to be kind of anti-market or anti-trust interest rate, I guess, which changes at its whim. Yeah, but again, Sabah kind of becomes more important in the 70s in what they're doing. And it helps to say that that kind of up until the Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy gets assassinated, Johnson. There is this kind of criticism of Iran sometimes, especially with the Kennedy's administration, with the lack of civil rights in Iran, even though Iran is still invited in the US and all that stuff. But the Nixon administration does not care. Like, as long as Iran is the Johnson administration actually like kind of curbs Iran on buying weapons at some point. But the Nixon administration is like, go buck wild, just be our friend when we need you in the region. Wish all likes. Yeah, there is a picture of Persepolis for the event that I was talking about. There are better footages of it in that documentary. Let's do this. Yeah, I won't do an hour and 50 minutes. Let me see here. Okay. So now we're in the 60s. Yeah, like I said, there is an exceptional kind of economic growth in the countries. People are getting educated in this. I was seeing some numbers between the rates of Turkey and Iran at some point, right? Iran is kind of beats a lot of these countries at this time. When you're talking about the rate of educating is public, right? You're going from 90% illiterate to kind of reducing it down to kind of 50s and 60s at this point. There's eightfold increase in oil production. There's the growing army we talked about, and then there's actually development of industries and government bureaucracies. And at this point, you're starting to actually have those um, the minor industrialization that didn't exist when, for example, Tudeh and this Marxist kind of parties had come to power due to the land reform. So it's, yeah, okay. So let's talk about this land reform thing. Almost 2/3 of peasant population changed relation with their landlord, right? Because again, rather than just living there and benefiting off of what is being produced on the land, they form corporations, right, between villages. Um, some of them buy the land of the landlords. Right now, they're the owners, and some of these landlords move to the cities. Some of them become rentiers. Right, being a renter is very different than just being a peasant on the land, because now you have some recognized rights at least. And but even all this land reform never kind of develops into an industry that can compete with oil. So Iran is still going to stay a oil production, and agriculture is going to move a little bit to the back. Another kind of connection here is important to talk about is the relationship between the landlords and the religious class, because the religious class are, again, as I've always said, they either live off of their relations with the bazaris, people in the market, or these people who own big lands. And some of the religious institutions actually, and people in those institutions have claims to these old lands, some through purchases, some through familial relations, right? Like they've been passed now. So this idea of land reform, right? I mean, that the government's kind of distributing this land or redistributing old claims between to other people is does become a little bit problematic, right? Because the religious class is literally seeing is importance diminished. Well, yet again, first there was the parliament and establishment of laws, which took a lot of what they were doing in the country or saw themselves as doing, and now this idea of not having land or the money or and the prestige of being connected to the landlords or the bazaris, right? So there is this discontent growing within the religious as the institutions, which are then articulated in a different way, and I'll get to that when we come to that. Um, so not as kind of intensely as what I put it here, the collapse of the rural society, but the rural society somewhat collapsed in a sense. I mean, maybe collapse is the wrong word, but it's radically changing. Right, and sometimes it's just the relationship between who owns what and who works what, but they're also what they produce is not as it's still important. It's feeding a lot of people. It's feeding a extremely growing population, but it's just not as lucrative as once it was, at least for the landlords. This is also a time when there's an increase in women's involvement in society, in parliament, as judges, being part of government bureaucracies again. And one of the most important laws that are passed at this time, and we have to come into this when we talk about Khomeini later on, is the Family Protection Law of 1967, which brings restriction on polygamy. Their rights to divorce becomes it's something important, that women can ask for divorce in the actual court of law. The minimum age of marriage is raised to 15, while at this time would have been not there at all. There are, of course, conventional limits of consummating marriage at puberty and all this stuff, but yeah. And it's important to point out that, of course, in the cities, a lot of people would have already been kind of closer to these laws, right? But when you come to rural areas, there are different standards and values, right? So, and I'm bringing that to say that different people are going to experience these different, right? So if you're like a woman in an educated or middle class, the family in Tehran, you might the raising of marriage age for you might just be symbolic, as seen as a movement towards progress and women's suffrage, right? But for a child that might have been given to marriage, this is kind of existential. It's just really helpful, right? While at the same time, the patriarchy or patriarchal system within rural areas are a lot more feel this a lot more radically, right? Sometimes in negative sense than some in the city, and not to just say like rural backward city high minded. I'm just kind of pointing to where most of these populations would be. Of course, there's all of them everywhere. Then women get to claim child custody and alimony, which are again expanded and taken out of. These are all taken, after the Reza Shah kind of abolishes the idea of Sharia court, then the civil courts and the laws of the country starts kind of taking charge of who takes what, right? And now the government is allowed to the judge that is implementing sitting on these custodial courts and whatnot can tell the woman can she have her children or not, right? So it doesn't like automatically go to the man anymore, right? And there's no religious clerk to say yes or otherwise, right? So this is important to keep in mind. And by 1975, these laws are expanded, which is uh, we'll get to them when we come to the 70s. All right, so I'm going to leave this here. I see some more people have joined us, but not as many as what I would like to. But this is kind of good. So okay, so I'll put this online, and the PDF stuff for this online. I've extended deadlines. Does anyone have any question about anything before I let you guys go? There's a delay. Okay, so there doesn't seem to be a question about anything. Please hit me up. Anything comes to mind, be a PowerPoint, whatever we can do to get through these hard quarantine times. Well, yeah, thank you so much for coming in, and I'll see you guys on Wednesday, same way. All right, guys, take care.